Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. Every time July rolls around, I like to celebrate the movie Tron. It has a unique visual style, a great soundtrack, and one of my favorite mottos, fight for the user. And its major villain was the Master Control Program, aka the MCP. Now, many decades later, we have far more sophisticated computers and more sophisticated digital effects, and we're still fighting MCPs. Which means this week we talk with Sandy Carielli and Janet Worthington about the state of Appsec for 2025 and just how many more LLMs and MCPs we can expect. Start your light cycles and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly.
Think your terminal emulation is secure? Think again. Passwords and firewalls alone won't protect you. Cyber threats are evolving, and so should your security. Rocket Secure Host Access gives you phishing-resistant, password-free protection with leading-edge encryption. Your mission-critical systems deserve more than good enough. Secure your green screen access and stay ahead of the threat. Rocket Secure Host Access. The future of TE is now. Learn more at securityweekly.com/rocketsoftware. This is episode 338, recorded on July 7th, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
And a happy Monday to you, or as our listeners would call it, Tuesday.
Happy Monday to you as well, John, because it takes us a good 24 hours to let our ideas settle here before we can release on a Tuesday. But helping us release on a Tuesday is Sandy, who's a principal analyst at Forrester, advising security and risk professionals on application security, with a particular emphasis on the collaboration among security and risk, application development, operations, and business teams. Hello, Sandy.
Hey, good to see you, Mike.
Happy to have you back. And of course, we also have Janet, who's a senior analyst for security and risk at Forrester. Janet covers product security, software supply chain, open source security, and DevSecOps. Her background is in product management and application security. Hello, Janet. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks, Mike and John, for having us on again.
So, and indeed it is again, we had you on back in April, but we also had you on way back in episode 290. This was back on July 8th, 2024. And I wanted to give a nod to that because it had one of my favorite state of AppSec. It was the ludicrous speed, which was a wonderful reference. And for those listeners who get the reference, Spaceballs 2 is coming out, so we're going to have you back for a post-watch party and have a recap, Janet, because I know how much you appreciated that.
Yes, I think we're at plaid this year.
We've gone plaid. Sadly, I think you can't spell plaid without AI. And boy, have we had a lot of AI and MCPs in here this year. And that's, I think, a theme of what your state of AppSec is. But I wanted to ask maybe up front is, okay, there's more AI, but is it really boiled down to just more code? And that's it? Or is AI doing something else for us? And who wants to tackle that one first?
I can start and I'll let Sandy jump in. So I think what's interesting when it comes to AI and when you're thinking about AppSec, we think of it in three categories. The first one is what AI can do to help AppSec, and we'll table that. The second one is these coding generating tools, and now, vibe coding are almost agentic way to create applications. And then the third way is actually securing the AI applications themselves. And so when we think about number two and number three, you brought up number two with AI generated code. Yes, it's a lot more code. We know it's a lot more code. I think Gemini said that, Google said 30% of all of their developer code is now written by AI. I think Cursor said that they're writing about 1 billion lines of code a day. And that is, humans today do about 2 billion. So, and they predict that that's going to flip soon. So 100%, lots more code. And then for us AppSec folks and just quality people in general, more code means more quality issues, more security issues, more functional regression issues. And so I think, when we think about what AI is doing, it's definitely supercharging the software development lifecycle and sort of shortening the time frames and time windows between everything, and just adding a lot more volume of code for all of us to kind of have to govern. That's my answer to that. Sorry.
But
Go ahead.
This is sort of the dream we've been waiting for the last 20, 25 years at least, right? Of like, get the humans out of the way, let the machines write the software, and hey, we can shut down this podcast. We're done. No?
Well,
Yeah. I mean, I think Sandy and I are going to go on vacation now. But yeah, so I think that you're right. Like, there's a lot AI can do to help Appsec. But I think with everything happening so fast and with some of the flaws that we still see in AI generated code, whether it's, I've tried vibe coding myself and it didn't sanitize any of my inputs. And if I wasn't looking at the code and I hadn't asked somebody to check it, I wouldn't have noticed it. It left API secrets in my code. Again, wouldn't have, if I'm just going along merrily and I'm not thinking about it, it would go in. Open source libraries. It suggested one, that one may not even have existed. It could have been insecure. So I don't think just yet our jobs, we're ready to go on vacation, John, but, maybe that's, long-term future.
For me, especially too, that volume, every time it's like 30% of our code or this number of code, I always do take those with a bit of a grain of salt, because for me, a lot of it feels like saying, if I do an npm-i, I've automatically generated a bunch of template code, and I could have 100 lines of my package lock file because of all the dependencies. And if that's getting counted in there, it's a bit misleading, because on the one hand, I agree that if we just have more code, it doesn't really matter who's generating it. We need to secure it. Are they making those simple mistakes of secrets in code, or not doing input validation, not doing whatever? We can pick your top 10 list. And that's where it feels like it's expanding the attack surface. But maybe before we belabor that point too much, which I always worry about, is AI helping us in any way, either on the code generated side or on, once we've deployed code? I know, Sandy, you often look at the deployed side of code too.
Yeah, and I do think that AI is starting to help us in that area, because a lot of the application security tools are adding in various AI assistants into their tooling to recommend rules, to provide guidance on remediation, to add that kind of side-by-side analyst helper. So the potential for having AI help us as security professionals is absolutely there. To Janet's point, though, those are very, very different things, right? AI as the assistant versus AI as the generating entity. There's very little cross between them right now. And we do have to look at them very differently. But yeah, absolutely. And this is the direction we want to have when we look at AI more broadly. We want AI to be helping us with certain tasks. We want it to be providing guidance. We want it to help summarize insights in maybe a more streamlined, useful way than we otherwise could. Helps us work faster, helps us be more efficient. The flip side to Janet's point is that we need to make sure we're doing it right.
I know, and that's where a lot of these conversations are. We want to get there, and maybe this is a bit of an echo of John's point too. It's nice to have the idea that the LLMs can get to this point, but have they does feel like a foundational question, and part of that have they maybe ties into who's buying the tools. Are people paying for the tools, or how are these purchasing decisions being made for coding assistance, or, and here I'm setting up a little bit of what you are noted in your report too, even just application security tools. And is this, tell us a little bit about what you discovered there in your in this report.
Sure. So I'd say we're seeing a couple things when it comes to AI. We're seeing, yes, those LLMs may not produce perfect code, but what we're seeing is a lot of AI agents to govern the output of that code. And so we're seeing a lot of security tooling coming out that is trying to make sure that we look at not in whether it's in real time while the coding is happening, and making sure that, hey, we're putting in the right type of code, we're fixing code as we're going along, giving you those real-time suggestions, not necessarily from the same LLM. So it's almost like the LLMs are watching the LLMs. And so I see that's sort of like part of what Sandy was saying, like the benefit that we're seeing in Appsec is really being able to use some of these AI agents, because at some point, nobody can review all this code, right? So if I'm going 30% faster than I normally do with my AI agent and checking in code, and John has to code review all that, how's he going to keep up with that? And so at some point, we are going to have to, help make sure that these AI agents can can detect, triage, and remediate this stuff all in real time. The second thing I'd say to your point, Mike, is that in our State of Application Security report every year, we ask this question, and it's like my favorite question to ask is, we're actually asking security decision makers, what is your application development team's involvement in choosing Appsec technologies? And it could be not involved, it could be involved, it could be final decision maker, and even that app dev team is a final decision maker and owns the purchase of it. And this year, I think it was pretty exciting. We saw that 62% of security decision makers said that actually the application development team was the final decision maker when buying Appsec tools. And that 43% were not only the final decision maker, but they also own the budget. So what that tells you is that developers are owning, and development organizations are owning more of not just the purchasing, but also with DevSecOps, more of the responsibility. And I think that's going to be crucial as we get into this, ludicrous speed of generating code. We can't rely on the traditional methods of, hey, security is going to check this before it goes out the door.
I think
that does seem. Go ahead.
Squeeze one in here, Mike. So I think what, from my code review days, what I would love that AI tool is like, yes, I'll look at your code, Jan, I'm sure it's great, but what I want to do is have something help me say, this is a section you need to look at, right? Because if you do 100 lines of code, even if it's great code, I'm guessing 70% of it I probably don't need to look at, right? It's sort of just boilerplate if tests and things like that. It's like, help me focus down on that one point that I'm interested in. So that's what I'd love to see the tools do. But I want to back up a second. And this is a question I've been sort of talking with friends and coworkers and different folks around. Those numbers we talked about at the beginning, 30% of code is being generated or 30% of teams are using it. I would love to hear what you guys have to say, from talking to customers about how are companies tracking that? Because if I go ahead and say grab Claude and start adding code and checking it in, I'm not going to leave the little co-authored by Claude line in there on my Git commit. How does a company know? If someone uses, addition on that, if someone uses Claude and they actually review it and they make some changes and then that gets committed, what portion gets, I'll say, attributed to the AI versus the human, and how are companies tracking that?
So I think it's not easy. I think when you have a company like Google who says, this was, Sundar Pichai that actually gave out that number, and he said it was actually difficult to not only track, but I think they obviously, because they, have their own LLMs, they probably have an easier way of being able to track all this than other folks. But what was interesting to his point was that not only were 30% was it generated, but when it came down to productivity, it was only a 10% uptake in productivity. And I think we can say that for a couple of reasons is, one, when you develop an application, coding is only a part of it. Right? There's other things that go into it, like testing, setting up your environment, deploying, et cetera, doing security testing, making sure you're commenting your code. And with any of these code generation tools, some of them are better at writing code than others, right? Some of them are purposely built. And when it comes to, as you're checking in code there are some tools, I'm not an expert in it, I'm not going to lie to you on that one, that will help you in some ways track. But to your point, if it says, I generated this block of code and the coding assistant, you come and change it, that's going to be difficult, but there are ways. I'm just not an expert in it. But I would say the more surprising thing to me is the fact that he noted that it was only a 10% uptake in productivity. So that kind of goes to the whole thing is it's not just code. You can't just think of, hey, we're coding, we're done. There's a lot more that goes into application development, including security.
And by the way, go ahead, John.
No, please.
Well, I was going to add on to what Janet was saying, because I think the other piece of this, Janet's talking about the code generation part of development with AI, but what about all of the API calls to various LLMs out there that are also adding into the application, that are also perhaps limited in terms of guardrails, that we also don't necessarily have a good view, that could also be shadow API calls? Add that on top of your initial question, John, and that adds an additional element to the attack surface of the application that maybe we have a better shot of measuring because we can potentially do some API discovery. But do we really know the full implications of that either is the other piece of this. And look, API usage and API risks related to AI have also exploded. So put those two pieces together for a minute.
Yeah, and part of when I hear that conversation about the code generation, that's a little bit why I was being snarky, admittedly, about the NPMI, is that you can easily generate a lot of lines of code that's just boilerplate. Then if you're counting that seems okay. An LLM was helpful there because it saved me the time to set up a skeleton, but that's not meaningful work in the sense of what you needed architecture design for, design decisions for, that I think Janet was also teasing out about that distinction between 30% of code ostensibly, but only 10%, far less increase in productivity. And then part of that too is then I would tie it to Sandy, all those APIs, it feels like there's a lot of shortcuts being taken just to hook these APIs together, especially just in authentication. Barely getting OAuth to work for MCPs and agents to connect on behalf of humans versus just let's hard code these connections, or let's just have this open, who cares about privilege, RBAC, things like this. And I'm curious if developers are owning more of the budget, they're investing more at least, or spending more. Have you seen a corresponding increase in the way that organizations are talking about how they're reducing risk or how they're securing either their code, running SAST or counting vulnerabilities, or having WAFs in place, for example? I know that's an area that you look at, Sandy. So I'm curious if there's any evidence of what that spending has turned into in terms of addressing that attack surface.
Yeah, so my initial snarky response to what you said about shortcuts around API usage and shortcuts around securing it is, well, what else is new? We've been here before. We've been dealing with this for a few years. So this is, another instance of, and understandably, by the way, this is probably the way it needs to work. We want to be innovating, we want to be trying out new things, and we figure out what the issues are, and we hopefully quickly catch up and address some of the security elements. But there is a degree to which we're learning the same lessons over and over. Here's the part that's kind of interesting in terms of investment to me. One of the questions that Janet and I asked for the first time this past year was we asked security leaders about which tools they were increasing their investments in the most. And, it included things like SAST and WAF and API security. It also included some newer tools like observability and ASPM and the like. And some of those newer tools got high marks, a large number of folks saying that they were planning to increase their investment. Now, it didn't say by how much, so we don't know that. But the interesting piece to me that came from this, and the reason I'm mentioning it, is you asked about investment in WAF and some of the other pieces. Even though WAF is this technology and this product that's been around for decades, WAF was one of the top 5. and API security was up there too. So as much as folks are doing a little bit of investment in some of the newer technologies, they are continuing to double down in their investment in what I would call the traditional application protection tools. And that signifies to me a realization that you still have to analyze and protect against the application traffic. That is still a core part of Appsec, and that's not going away. And if anything, the increase in application development, the increase in number of API calls just highlights how much more important that's going to be.
I know you say traditional. I put that in a category of boring tools, but boring in security isn't necessarily bad. If they do their job right. I know. But yeah, but to see WAFs having very much a renaissance to protect these APIs because they may be brittle, they may have a lot of vulns that just need to be defended against, it makes me a little bit sad. So here's another question I'll throw out to the group. If we've had humans writing, 70% of this code still, and every October rolls around, we have security awareness training or code security training. PCI, likes to recommend this. How come we don't have security awareness training for LLMs? Or who's going to be the startup that's creating security awareness training for LLMs just so they can make better code? Is this going to happen?
Well, I think there's already tools trying to help with that, less in the terms of what you would consider traditional training of PowerPoint slides. But there are tools.
We can call that boring.
We can call that boring. We are seeing more tools out there trying to kind of put guardrails around the input responses and the output responses for these LLMs. And, if you, look at some of the tools that are coming out, they even try to help with the interaction between the AI agents. And with, I think you mentioned MCP, which is, a protocol now for these way for different AI to talk together. If you have like a cursor or a windsurf or a copilot, that is writing code, there are now people who are now, I shouldn't say people, there are tools that are trying to help using MCP, that cursor or whatever, to write better code with rule-based information, or also using MCP to come in and do real-time detection as part of it. But there are some things you can do for these like coding tools to kind of help put guardrails. And whenever Sandy and I have talked about developer training, I mean, Sandy has done some great work on developer security champions, et cetera. Nobody remembers the 30-minute SQL injection, tutorial that you had to take. You do remember hands-on, right? So as you're coding, Sandy and I were always big proponents of like these SaaS tools providing that real-time feedback. So you were still in the context, and it might have a link to hands-on training or a link to quick tips to learn more about a vulnerability that might have just popped up, for example. And we've never really been huge proponents of sitting down every year and just having to ingest it because nobody is going to remember that. And I think we talk a lot about guardrails for developers, and it's the same thing. We're talking about guardrails for these agents, guardrails. When we get to agentic, that's a whole new world, but we're going to continue to need guardrails. And I think that's really where security people are going to really shine. We're going to get less out of the minutia every day of being like, okay, developers, here's a secure SQL injection. You haven't fixed it yet. This is how you fix it. Come on. I think as developers are owning more of that with DevSecOps, as we have more agents that are running in real time, providing remediation feedback, we become orchestrators. We kind of become conductors of all this and say, hey, if I look at this system as a whole, where do we really need to think about what needs to be plugged in, what's missing, et cetera? And so I think that, over time, we'll become more orchestrators, as will the developers themselves, of all these agents. And yes, there's going to need to be training to understand how you put these things together and what security gaps you need to think about. But overall, I think we go back to you need guardrails. And without guardrails, you're either going to slow down innovation because you're going to be like, hard gate, can't move, somebody's got to check it, even if it's a machine. Okay, check it. Okay, no. Or you get to the point where things are just flying out the door and you're having a bunch of issues in production and the WAF is sitting there trying to block everything. Sandy, do you have any thoughts on that? I know you did a lot with Security Champion.
Well, a couple of things around this. And yet, tying a lot of this together, look, ultimately the goal of security and in collaboration with development and the entire Champions programs, the goal is to get product out the door, right? And even with WAF, when we talk about that, if WAF is blocking everything, as you say, if it's doing that, then we fail because then we're annoying the product teams because they're losing customers. So yes, it all has to tie together. And, the best Champions programs and the best training, it's really about learning and collaboration. And it's not the 30-minute PowerPoint on SQL injection, because SQL injection is still a thing 25 years later. So I think we can say the 30-minute PowerPoint did not work. I think we're all pretty clear on that because I've been talking about SQL injection since around 2002. And it's still there.
That
so
PowerPoint
clearly
so many
something didn't work. Yes. I think we can say pretty clearly the PowerPoint did not work. This is about getting everyone on the same page. It's about having the tools provide just-in-time instruction. And circling back to what we were saying about AI assistants in WAF and bot management and API security tools, having those provide guidance to the folks on the operations side about how to address issues in a more effective way so that, again, you're not slowing down development. You're not annoying the product team. So there's the training and education from the standpoint of just in time for developers, but then there's also just in time guidance for the operators that are trying to manage all of these tools and protect applications in real time. And it all kind of goes together here. But yeah, it sounds a little bit cliched, and now we're going into our box of cliches, Mike. I'm sorry to say that, this is about everyone working together and collaborating, but you need that cross-functional element, and you need the trust between all the different stakeholders, or this does not work.
And it's interesting to pull in. We need everyone collaborating because I think in this discussion, part of that everyone includes an LLM or an agent or an MCP of some sort. But what I'm curious about, why is the prompt engineer just not the saying code generation, comma, but make it secure as my go-to joke there? Because if there's a reviewing and you're talking about interacting hands-on experience of writing code, how do you get to the point of the developer or Appsec reviewing code and seeing those types of problems that are, this is a code smell. This is an anti-pattern. Here's a security problem that's creeping up. And I'm bringing that up because actually last week we talked with Louis Niffenegger, who was talking about manual code review, and he was saying how AIs can be assistive, but it seems that the premise of AIs will generate more code and humans will just look at it, looks at that old cliche of, more eyes, shallow bugs. That doesn't seem to be working. And I guess I'm going more into a rant here. I'm trying to set up a good question out of this. So let me pause and turn it into a question in the sense of, you talking about investment and people buying tools. Have organizations been paying attention to their spend on AI, whether it is just the AI code generation, the AI assistance, or is it still early days for that? And people just have money to burn in these days.
It's an interesting question. I don't have any data specifically on AI spend around Appsec. I will say overall, Appsec spend and planned spend is increasing, but I don't know how much of that to attribute to AI. So, and in a lot of cases, if the AI is built into another tool, like a lot of these assistants, it may be hard to carve out what the actual AI spend is there. Probably easier to say how much you're investing in, say, Copilot.
I'll add just one thing is it's less on the security side, but on the development side, you do see a lot of these DevSecOps platforms that are trying to measure productivity, and they'll try to measure the productivity when AI is involved. They're probably the ones that I think are doing the closest to it, because they can see things like, when the feature request was put into Jira, how long did it take it then for somebody to do the design document, then to do the coding, testing, gets out the door, oh, here comes another bug kind of thing. They probably have the most visibility. And I think they have, they don't see the whole end-to-end system, because there are definitely things that happen after deployment. But I think they have the biggest reach to kind of start looking at productivity, AI, and the costs from that perspective.
I'm curious too, because you also pointed out that you don't count lines of code these days in terms of developer productivity. That I think came and went, or at least I hope it went to a great degree a long time ago. You were looking more at the productivity or feature velocity, for example. And that's that. I guess I'm more just commenting on that, is that's a great thing to be looking for in these conversations about are LLMs being helpful or not. But in the spirit of me making more comments than questions, the two of you, Janet and Sandy, you get a chance to ask orgs a lot of these AppSec-oriented questions every year. Is there a question that you're never able to ask them for whatever reason? Or is there always a question that you really wish you could ask them, but you're pretty sure orgs just don't want to admit to, or they're still hesitant to discuss? Is there something to tease out of what what AppSec in 2025 is looking at, how these orgs are looking at?
I think for me, when you do a large survey, any sort of survey, and it's someone responding to questions, you can ask, what are you doing? You can give options. You can ask, what are your priorities? You can have agree or disagree. The question you can't ask in a survey like that is why? Or what do you mean by that? And I think that's sometimes it's that next level that you can get into in a conversation, but you can't necessarily, if someone says, okay, we're prioritizing API security this year. Why? What's driving that? What's the thing that has you concerned? I think those are some of the questions I wish I could ask. It's around the whys as opposed to the whats. And there's only so much you can ask on that in a survey. That's why a lot of the research that we do is a combination of more, the quantitative survey and more qualitative conversations, because that's the part that you can't get just from having someone fill it out.
Yeah, I think easily for me, I'd be like, why? Or maybe I would ask how long do you think you'll be using LLMs? I would love to be asking that just and get the experience from, are they being helpful? Are they not? Is it still early days? I don't know, Janet, is there another why question you would ask on there? Or is it more of the what the heck are you doing type of category that you would throw out, that you want out? Yeah.
To Sandy's point, these are great surveys. Before I came to Forrester, I didn't even realize the world of information that we have and how you can look at data and correlate it. I think what I'd love to ask too is really how application security people are interacting with the rest of the organization and the rest of the business when it comes to AI applications and securing those, because it can't just be on AppSec, right? Yes, there are certain things we can check for. We can look at, during the CI/CD pipeline for prompt injection and the responses. We can make sure there are no secrets, et cetera. Sandy can have an AI firewall in production, for example, which are, newer-ish. Sorry, Sandy, didn't mean to take away that thunder. But there are other teams out there. We talk to customers and I'll talk to AppSec. There's a whole AI team and they're not part of that, right? There are security people on that team, but AppSec's not there. And so my question is who else does AppSec need to work with? There's data security, right? The data sets can get poison that you're using. That's not AppSec, that's data security, right? You have to worry about identity. What do people have access to? What do these machines, these agents have access too. That's a whole different group of people. So I would love to see how people are sort of managing all the components that go into securing an AI application, because it's pulling in so many more people from a security point of view, from a development point of view, from people who business users who are citizen developers that have never, coded before, all these different people. I'd love to see how, that all kind of integrates together, and really at a large survey scale, just to kind of see it at large. We can see it by talking to our customers, but I'd love to see it, in aggregate.
That makes me think, I want to squeeze in at least one more question on my part and then see if John has any others too. We talk a lot about Appsec and, does Appsec become engineering? Because Janet, you've mentioned many times guardrails, and I'm a fan of Appsec having an engineering component to it, building those guardrails, or at least working with developers to do that. That's all very, Appsec engineering, Appsec this, application security. Have either of you come across privacy engineering, privacy security, as you mentioned, this aspect of working with data, because LLMs consuming data, MCPs working with data to be whether a chatbot agent or a glorified chatbot or some type of LLM that's interacting with user data. I can make a case as is just application security, but it feels like I would hope there's privacy considerations in there as well. Is this a thing, or is this something that I'm going to ask you again for an update for in 2026 and cross my fingers?
So my first answer is there probably is, but it's not intersecting much with Appsec yet. That said, we have a couple of colleagues that basically spend all of their time on privacy. And you could have someone like Enzo Yiannopoulos on the show, and I think she would give you a really deep dive into the privacy considerations around a lot of this. So it's definitely there. But I think you're asking a more fundamental question in terms of, and it goes back to what Janet said, how do all of these different stakeholders and people actually intersect and talk to each other?
Yeah.
And I've even heard, Mike, to your point, I've heard people say, the role of application security engineers might even be expanded to more, yes, security when it comes to these AI applications. You can worry about data leakage, content leakage, jailbreaks, manipulation, prompt injection. But what about safety? Like bias, harmful content? What about hallucinations? How precise is the RAG output, for example? What about business alignment? Is it like not telling your customers about your competitors? And so I think what's happening right now is the industry hasn't solidified yet, right? I mean, we have red teaming tools now that are kind of looking at some of that. The question is, who owns that? Is that Appsec owning that red teaming, tools and bias? Are they just overseeing it? Are they working with an internal red team that's running this stuff? So I think we're all still trying to figure it out. And I think it's exciting because I think while, yes, security tends to be a step behind, at least this time we're more part of the conversation. And I think we're part of the conversation because people have realized over the years, one, what security, can do, if you're not secure when you put this stuff out, but also because of some of these other things, because of the safety issues and some of the hallucinations. I think people are thinking more broadly about quality and about some of these things that they never had in the past before. So I think in some ways, AI is kind of helping us all kind of talk about stuff more, but I don't think the industry has settled on best practices yet.
Keep my fingers crossed for that. And I like the
We're
the
so
quality
far away from
aspect.
best practices. Go ahead.
Well,
But
and
what, a couple of years into this? I mean, history says we weren't going to figure this out in a year.
And you made the point, you've been talking about SQL injection for 20, 25 years. But I will make the point too, Appsec didn't develop into a cross-site scripting engineer or SQL injection engineer. Whereas today we feel like, we've got a prompt engineer or prompt injection engineer. So I'm hoping that there are certain things that's not a repeating history, but there's certain history that we don't want to invent whole cloth because that doesn't feel like a good direction.
Mike, can I give you some good news?
Yep.
Oh, sorry, Sarah. Go ahead, Sandy.
Okay.
So,
yes. I love good news. Yes.
Every year we ask, so these security decision makers, almost 2,000 of them, have you been breached? And yes, how many times in a year? And if they have been breached, we ask them about the vector. Was it an external attack? Was it an internal insider? Was it a third-party company, for example? When it comes to external attacks, that tends to be the biggest part of that pie. And then we drill down one more time, asking about how was the external attack carried out? Well, I'll start with the bad news. The bad news is software supply chain breaches and software vulnerabilities are at the top. But what's further down? What has gone down the list over the years? Web application exploits, SQL injection, XSS, FRI.
Okay.
And why is that? Because I think we have really started putting guardrails in place. I really think we are finally getting to the point where people are embracing DevSecOps. We actually see that in our questions. We can talk about that if you want. But, yes, software supply chains, that's just a big, messy, hairy, complex, interdependent, interwoven chain that we have to get our handle on. But I do think that we have made some progress over the years in the fact that these aren't bumping up to the top. They used to be higher than phishing. They used to be higher than social engineering. Weaker stolen credentials. It used to be higher than that. It used to top the list. When I started at Forrester, I can't even remember how many years ago. Let's say 3 plus, 4 plus. It was at the top. Now it's gone down. And I think that is just something we should celebrate, that folks like you, Mike, and you, John, and Sandy, you guys have been talking about this for so long that I do think the guardrails and the ideas have started to help in some ways. But we just have new landscapes that we have to think about.
You are making me feel optimistic, Janet. Sandy, should I stay there? You're going to bring me back down. Let's get some final words from you.
Ultimately, I'm not going to bring you back down, because what I would say is, let me think about how I want to say this. History repeats itself in this industry, right? There's an element, and I've joked to people, if I ever write a book on Appsec, I can write the same chapter 12 times and just change the names of the technology. And it's true to a degree. But each time we get a little bit better at it. Each time we get a little bit faster at identifying the causes, identifying the issues. So, okay, yes, it took us a couple of decades to figure out code security. And it probably took us a decade maybe to start really looking at open source security and some of the stuff that Janet covers with respect to SCA. And it took us a few years to really start talking about API security. And now we're, 2 years into deep AI development, and we're having these security conversations. So we're talking about it faster. Let's put it that way. That's something.
Okay.
It's not everything, but it does speak to the fact that as an industry, we have gotten better at picking up the patterns. And there is something to that.
Okay, I'll take that. I know John can bring me back down, but we'll save that for the news segment. Speaking of, we are talking about things faster, but we still run out of time on these segments. But before I let you go, Janet, Sandy, one of the things we always do, and I think you're familiar with this, we ask our guests to describe Appsec in 3 words. And it's going to be fun to see how your 3 words have changed. You don't need to explain or justify. You just need to give us what that will be. And let's have Janet go first, and then Sandy can close us out.
Sure.
What have you got?
So I think my new one will be velocity without compromise.
I like it. Got to follow that one up now.
Okay. Let's see. More than AI.
That's very close to more human than human, so I'll take a Blade Runner reference any day. Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Janet. Thank you, John, as well. We're going to wrap up here, but obviously we'll have you back, and we'll have you back at least before the state of AppSec in 2026. Plus, we'll also have to talk about Spaceballs, too, when it comes out. So thanks once again.
I'm in.
Excellent. We're going to take a quick break now and return with Merchandising of the Week. Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Sandy Carielli and Janet Worthington about the state of Appsec in 2025, how much LLMs are expanding the attack surface, and how much Appsec is repeating itself. I'm your host, Mike Shima, who's currently optimistic, but I'm here with John Kinsella, who may bring some of that optimism back down after our conversation with Janet at the end there with Janet and Sandy.
I'm a very optimistic person. I don't know what you're talking about. Just not when it comes to Appsec.
Right. Well, I was going to say, we're going to have to put that to a test as we dive into some of the news this week. And there's an article I wanted to kick off here. This is from Watchtower. How much more must we bleed? Which, John, I'll throw this over to you, but the very first line speaks to my heart. And maybe you included this as a slight commentary on me, because it starts out, before you dive into our latest diatribe. I'm like, oh, whoops. So let me avoid too much of diatribe as I did last segment, and throw this one over to you. What should we be worried about here?
They really had fun writing this. These are probably one of our top two sources for stories like this, I'd say, for the last 6 months or a year. Watchtower is both doing some really great research, but also just how they actually spin a story of it is quite entertaining. So in this case, they found a few CVEs related to Citrix Bleed, another memory disclosure. And so what was sort of interesting about this is beside the fact that it's a device that you want to put in front of your systems to make them secure, and they're like, haha, not so fast. But just how they sort of tease through the issue itself, issue on the login page, sort of fairly standard types of things we hear about. It looks like some of these vulnerabilities have been there for quite a while. How they actually go through as standard, a type of thing I like. How do we actually find this? How the way they walk through to the reader of, we started here, we looked at the source, we found this, we tried this. Here's how we do root cause analysis. Getting into the device, taking a closer look, showing some pseudocode that gives an example of how this is actually executed the compromise. And then down to the memory leak itself, along with, even got a video in here. So it's fairly well written. I think it's neat how they do this type of thing. And the reason I say that, right, it's not just for like me talking about something here on the show and we've said in the past. If you can make something entertaining to read, you're going to hold the reader's view longer, right? So if I'm writing something for work or try to come up with something for ASW, if I can make it entertaining, it's going to hopefully not just catch our listeners' attention, but people at work who I'm trying to convince. So there's reasons we like these type of things.
Absolutely. Just +1 to both the education and entertainment of this. And it also ties back to the conversation we had last week with Louis about looking at like patch differences with CVEs, because yes, CVEs can be extremely boring, but they can be informative if you're looking at what the code looked like before compared to what it looked like after, in the sense of just learning coding patterns, common mistakes that humans make, or in 2025, as Janet and Sandy were telling us, what LLMs mistakes we'll make as well. And similar to this write-up, not quite as entertaining perhaps, but still very informative, I pulled in from Liren Tull. We've had him as a guest a long time ago, but the Node.js security newsletter. He wrote up about critical command injection flaw in iOS simulator MCP server exposes development environments. And it does what it says on the tin. But the reason I pulled this out is it walks through, similar to the Watchtower article, here's what the flaw is, as well as he shows here's what a better solution would have been. So rather than doing, this is going to be the boring, like, what, duh part, rather than doing just string concatenation and strings, variable substitution for your command, just use the exec args. There is a built-in capability to create a list of arguments to a command you want to send. And to me, I wanted to highlight this because I do appreciate the writing, but it also feels like we're going to have poor Sandy on talking, as she was talking about, the 2 decades plus of SQL injections she's seen. There's going to be, going into 2.5 decades now of command injection. And it just feels like reinventing a lot of solved problems. And I don't know where I'm going with that, other than hopefully we can educate and entertain more people so they can pay attention to these things.
So you're asking if I had other news articles. There was another one actually, because Anthropic also had vulnerabilities in their MCP server this week. I suspect now that we've found a few breadcrumbs in this area that people are going to have a blast. The number of MCP servers out there is growing like cockroaches, like all the rest of this stuff. And obviously, I'd guess the vast majority, 95%, have not been written with Appsec in mind. The interesting one from me here, I don't think we've seen yet MCP servers used as a way to exfiltrate data out of a company or an organization. It's pretty ripe for it, right? Like, hey, you need to get access to your Outlook or to your code base. Go ahead and put this MCP server and use it with your agent to connect. Next thing you're like, hey, why is there this stream of data going out from the MCP server to the internet? So I think that's something we'll have to keep an eye on in this space.
Absolutely, because there's also the aspect of the I'm trying to pause here to organize my thoughts, as I rarely do. But the promise here of MCPs is that you can have multiple agents talking to each other, but there's no sense, at least right now, of this is a more trusted agent, less trusted agent, or this agent should only be dealing with your calendar versus dealing with the command line, for example. And as you pointed out, there's a lot of exfiltration here. I think too, and here I'm looking at an article from, this is from Alligo Security, and you always love a title that starts with critical RCE in an MCP. And it's basically also pointing out the idea of DNS rebinding, which I admit I had not appreciated and paid attention to until I stopped paying attention to like 10 years ago, something like that. It's once again these old issues, which I'm going to put my optimistic hat on, or keep my TARDIS hat on. Sorry, I like it. But to hope that seeing something like this and saying, just because MCPs are popular, let's at least take advantage to nudge the browser vendors to finally fix these types of issues, because they've struggled to have the privacy preserving aspects of tamping down access to localhost 0.0.0, etc. Seeing I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this succinctly and failing, but seeing that there's a lot of people now more people being impacted, or more data potentially being abused in this manner, hopefully just means that browser vendors when Chrome specifically will fix this. So that's the best. I'm filled with hope today.
One of the interesting things about this, if we take a step back and look at it philosophically, I think, is a lot of the stuff that we've had developers doing over the last decade has been becoming more either cloud-based or API consumption-based, right? It's more sort of write some code, go do something with it over there. So that's why API, WAFs or firewalls came into existence, gateways if you want to call them that, and had that sort of, you had an idea what was going on. With this more modern stuff now, as people start using the Gen AI, I'll say, use that phrase, and they bring in an agent or two and they want to do something agentic, suddenly you have to connect that little agent thing to something else. So what I'm sort of describing is you're now getting developers back to running third-party, probably binaries. I'm just thinking through, I'm sure you could get source for these and run them that way, but I think the main way to install Cloud Code right now is with an npm command, or that's one of the recommended ways to get it on there. So we're back to that world again, where it'd be very easy to say, hey, go ahead and download this thing and run it for me, which is probably not a step forward. So we'll have to keep an eye on that too.
Yeah, and I think I appreciate how you're framing that. And here's where I want to pull in another article or another project, see how this ties into that. OWASP has, as we all know, as I've like to remind people, has a long list of top 10 list. Exactly. I'm not going to say top 10 list. I'm going to say testing guide. So this is the OWASP AI testing guide. It's still pretty early. It's still, speaking of zeros, it's version 0.0.0. But it is, I linked to the GitHub repo, and it has a long list of kind of checklists, although it's not necessarily a checklisty thing like the ASVS or something like that. And it does have some good content around threat modeling but my immediate reaction to it was a lot of tying together this top 10 list, this threat modeling framework, or this threat modeling reference, which Stride is not a framework. It's just a list of 6 words. But being pedantic aside, there was a lot of things that were kind of the background of this is what you should be doing. And then it did get into a couple aspects of here are some concrete tests to look at. So I think what I'm really trying to grab on for is how this to be a robust testing guide in the way that the web application security testing guide is, which is pretty long, pretty comprehensive, goes through a bunch of different technologies. But obviously here, I think it's still early days. I'll be very forgiving about the state it's in and looking forward to it. So is this something that you're already familiar with, John, or is this going to be some more of some weekend reading for you?
No, I'm not familiar. It's sort of scanning through it briefly. So I've obviously, maybe not obviously, I've been bitten by the Gen AI bug in the last few weeks, and it's not for like any professional reason. It just sort of caught my interest finally. So it is interesting to me. I've been pondering: do I want to get? I'm at the point right now. I'm trying to figure out: do I want to get involved in the AI security side of things, like of the OWASP groups and things like that, or CSA? I like that they breaks it down into AI model testing versus the application testing versus infrastructure versus data. But still at the same time, I was looking at one of them. Well, let's just pick another one. Test for hallucinations. The point I'm going to say here is, well, I think this is interesting that they're doing and giving you things to think about. It feels a little bit like back in the day when we were writing, or people were writing docs about how to test for cross-site scripting, or how to test that your WAF protects against it. Good luck. And it feels a little like that. These are examples, and these will get you thinking about it. But it would be very difficult to make a comprehensive list just due to the nature of the beast.
Yeah, and that's a good example that I do like that this calls out some very specific LLM and Gen AI related items. It's not just use input validation, check your software supply chain. It does call out some of those areas just because obviously they're related. But even with the hallucinations, it gets into that aspect of, are you really testing for hallucinations, or do you have controls against what happens if a hallucination occurs? And here I'll just use a very simple reference of software supply chain. It doesn't matter about hallucinations if we've already considered threats of typo squatting, malicious, a software package being taken over. No, it's governance changes. These are already problems that are well known. LLM adds to them, but we should already have controls in place. And so that's where I would hope that we don't go too far down about the nomenclature of different types of hallucinations, and we sound like we're at continuing at a Deadhead concert or something silly, and we're going into like, here is just a good software supply chain. Here's a good package management controls. So those are my hopes. So I'm continue to riff on the optimism for this week.
Yeah, it's one of the patterns I've seen in the last week or two is not just having a README in your, I'm just talking again about Gen AI generated or assisted code bases. So not just having a README in there that's generated by the bot so it knows what it did, or having a design doc so you can see what it's designed and how, but I'm seeing people start put in like a rules.md with the intention of this is instructions back to the LLM of this is how I want you to put some of those guardrails in. The question then becomes, that's a neat idea, but how do you ensure what's in that? How do you ensure it's looking at it and reading it? Is it comprehensive enough to do at that location? Should there be some sort of enterprisey version where that file exists somewhere else, not local code base? So I can see people being scrappy and trying to play with some of those things. And it's probably also for code quality or code style or things like that as well. But yeah, it's as I was saying off air, it's a little Wild West. So we'll see what comes out over time.
It's funny because if someone had just dropped into the conversation while you were describing that, I don't know that they would have had the context of, are you describing a rules.md for a human or for an LLM? Because the reaction to it is both non-deterministic in both angles. And that's what I wanted to highlight. And that's one of just my frustrations, which is, thank you for laughing. We try to be entertaining here. But I'm curious, how much of that are you trying to, what are you discovering there as you're looking at this?
Yeah, I'm playing with this stuff a lot. So the rules itself, I haven't started tinkering with. The most recent little trial is I've got like a project that I'm building. I'm working on building an agent actually with using Claude. But one of the things I noticed is like after 2 or 3 days, aka most of this weekend, of tinkering with it, I thought, hey, wouldn't it be neat to actually have like a list of the prompts which I'd given this thing to build it to the state where it is now? It's becoming a fairly large project. And that, so I had restarted Claude and I asked it to do that, and it just gave me the list from the last history. But the reason I'm thinking of this is if I can give you a list of the prompts, maybe 20 or 30 prompts I've given it, how close to the same application gets created the next time around? So that's, and maybe that's why it's not there by default, but I want to go back and try again. Like, okay, if I have this, is there a value of having that in an open source project of like, hey, here's how this was created? Will allow someone else to reproduce or learn, or so it's one of the things I'm sort of thinking about there. Yeah.
That's cool. And I think I'll pull in another article this was from mid-June. I think the update was in June 18th or so, but even the model context protocol. So that they have a security best practices section, or at least they've recently updated and expanded on. And so I will continue to make fun of MCPs, especially because Tron had the OG MCP in my mind. But a lot of what I'm looking at section 221 of risks, and I wanted to pull this in just kind of as a reference to the OWASP AI testing guide. The risks they call out are relatively high level, but they're still good in the sense of can you circumvent some security controls? How well enforced are they? Accountability and audit, I like in there just of what did the LLM do? I think that maybe ties back into, can it generate the same code? Does it pay attention to the rules like you were describing? Mm-hmm. And of course, there's that trust boundary issue too. Why is my MCP that's working my calendar accessing my command line or file system? Where should these boundaries be in a world where we actually don't have any real boundaries?
And you know what's interesting about that? I mean, the question you have to ask is, do we care if the code's the same? Or do we care that the resulting program does the same thing with the same inputs? Again, I think part of what's going on here is we need to think about how we change how we think about these things. One of the other thoughts, and this is sort of security related, so I'll say this and we can move on to try and not be LLM weekly. As I talked to some of my staff and sort of think through some of the ideas of how we're playing with things, or are we playing with, or what's going on, someone said to me, the one thing I realized is like, if I do a bunch of code with an LLM, I don't have as intimate familiarity with the code. And I'm not saying that this is work code or not work code, but I don't have familiarity with that code. So when it comes to troubleshooting something I see in the error message, it won't be like, oh, I remember writing that in the application. It'll be like, what's that? Where did that come from? Is that my code or is that a third-party thing? So some folks are starting to grab onto that as like, oh, that's a bad thing. I'm not as intimately familiar with, my little pony. On the counter side, maybe we need to be thinking about having the tools that are troubleshooting it be a little bit better at recognizing that, since they wrote the code also. So I think there are a lot of these things are, and part of the reason I'm playing with this, like, how do we think about it? How do we think about security? Do we care about looking at each little line of code it's written, or the result that's coming out of it?
And I'm going to use that to tie into an article that I had pulled from CISA. And again, this is a little bit of repetition. Memory safe languages, reducing vulns in modern software development. Mm-hmm. You've heard about this all last year. I was a big fan of it. But the reason I wanted to, I include it honestly just more as an FYI for those people who love reading PDFs about memory safety. But part of the reason I wanted to highlight it is it does have some sections about thinking about what we're writing and thinking about the engineering. It's not saying it's too reductive to say rewrite everything into memory safe code. And that's explicitly not what it's saying. It's saying look at new code being written, make those decisions, look at those hotspots. And it's what you were describing as being not as intimately familiar with the code made me think of those hotspots. How do I know that, oh, here's where we're parsing some user-generated content. This is a great place to be memory safe, to do something in a stronger language, because parsing is so rife with errors, especially when you get into images, let alone audio or video files. And so I like the idea of maybe even just LLMs pointing out, here's a hotspot. Here's an area to pay attention to. Familiarize yourself with this because this is consequential, as opposed to here's a lot of plumbing framework that is just has no sources or sinks, to use the terms of art that are of interest to security. So that's my way of tying everything together and attempting to not be completely LLM security this week.
I think every time OWASP comes out with another top 10 list, CISA has to come out with talking about memory safe languages again.
Fair enough.
But at the same time, no, I think this one is there. I think we can feel their the story they're trying to tell feels to be maturing. From a point of view of it's this is longer doc. It's not just that, but like they're actually, and it's probably as they're having more of these conversations with folks out there, it's like, what does this mean? How to use this? I'm just looking at section academia versus how the corporate world looks at some of these things. In the U.S. government, obviously, they care about. So you can at least to me, it feels like there's a little more maturities in it. So it's not quite, my point being, the same doc that they've had for the last 3-4 years. There's definitely some finesse in it, and it feels like a more interesting thing to read.
And I think my final comment here too is that I'm hoping that this conversation around memory safety informs MCP safety, LLM generation, Gen AI, our use of it. I care less about the code it's generating, but more of how we're using it with MCPs, and just that the architecture of how data is connected between agents, agentics, APIs. We can go down the VC hype list, what have you. But part of it is so that, as Sandy and Janet pointed out, we're still early days, but hopefully we can accelerate this conversation so that 10 years from now, we don't have CISA putting out LLM safety PDFs because it's already been rolled into the protocol, it's rolled into those designs, and we're avoiding these simple mistakes of committing secrets, command injection flaws, et cetera, et cetera. So that's my hope. So I'm going to stop there because that leaves me on an optimistic angle. And John, I'll give you the. We'll see you struggle if you want to continue. You want to continue that theme or embrace all. How should you take it? How do you want to take us out?
Why do you do this to yourself? So apologies in hindsight to our producer who was yelling at me a few minutes ago for typing while we were talking on air or on recording. And what I was doing is I went back to Claude and said, hey, that code that we were writing over the weekend, are there any vulnerabilities in it? And it came up with a pretty good list of things: SSL certificate validation bypasses, prompt injection vulnerabilities, information disclosure and errors, file permission warnings only. Your favorite, there's a path traversal risk in here, logging security, network security, debug information exposure, dependency security. So long story short, it wrote a lot of code, but it didn't think about that once. But at the same time, if we have that, but make it secure, we can go back and think about it and look at it. And we should be doing that whether we're using an LLM or not. So I'll finish on that note. How about that?
There we go. Yeah, whether using an LLM or not, that's the key there. So we got to get those, but make it secure T-shirts. We'll work on that. But once again, I want to give very heartfelt thanks to John Kinsella, being the human amongst all these LLMs. Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us. Please remember to subscribe. Please check out the show notes. Share us on the socials. And speaking of insecure code, check out Feel the Heat by New Arcades. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.